Oh, darling, that dress looks economical. The word hung in the air like poison. My mother-in-law's carefully manicured fingers gesturing dismissively at my black sheath dress. 20 pairs of eyes turned to examine me in the silence that followed, champagne glasses frozen midway to lips. Patricia Walsh, Boston Brahmin accent, Newport summer home, and a family tree etched into New England history had just made her judgment, expecting me to shrink as I always had before. What she didn't know was that the cheap dress I wore was the prototype for my spring collection. What she couldn't see was that the label she'd mocked at every family gathering had just dressed celebrities at the Met Gala and signed a 7-figure deal with Neiman Marcus that morning. For 2 years, I'd kept my success quiet, enduring her condescension and thinly veiled insults about my background, my career choices, my heritage. But something inside me snapped that night. The secret I'd been holding was about to turn this Thanksgiving dinner into a reckoning no one in the Walsh family would ever forget. I never meant to marry into New England aristocracy. James and I met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, him in his rumpled Yale Law sweatshirt, me sketching designs between shifts as a barista. He loved that I was different, a first-generation Chinese-American from Queens with parents who ran a tailoring shop and taught me to sew before I could write my name. When James proposed after 18 months, I said yes to him, not to his family legacy. The Walshes weren't just rich, they were American royalty. 5 generations of judges, senators, and corporate executives. Their family Christmas card featured a literal mansion. Patricia, my mother-in-law, maintained her position as the family gatekeeper, deciding who belonged and who didn't. And from the moment James brought me home, she made it clear which category I occupied. How industrious of you to want a career, she'd said at our first meeting, examining my portfolio with fingertips as if the sketches might stain her skin. Though I'm sure once you and James have children, you'll want something more substantial. By substantial, she meant acceptable to her social circle. The subtle digs became a constant refrain, always delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. At my wedding, she'd introduced me to her friends as so creative, in a tone that made it sound like I ate crayons. When I wore a vintage Chanel suit to Easter brunch, she asked if I'd found it at one of those cute second-hand stores. The worst was during a family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, when James and I had been married for 6 months. Patricia hosted a dinner for some very important friends and pointedly didn't tell me the dress code. I showed up in summer casual to find everyone in cocktail attire. Before I could retreat, Patricia loudly announced, "Here's my new daughter-in-law. We're still working on teaching her our little customs." The table laughed. I stood frozen as Patricia added, "Don't worry, dear. Some people are just born knowing these things, and some have to learn." That night, I cried in our guest room while James confronted his mother. He returned with her non-apology. I was just trying to help her fit in. What the Walshes never understood was that I came from my own kind of royalty. My grandmother had been one of Shanghai's most sought-after dressmakers before the revolution forced her to flee. My parents had rebuilt that legacy stitch by stitch in a tiny Queens storefront, working 18-hour days to put me through Parsons. The artistry in my blood stretched back generations longer than the Walsh family fortune. After that Martha's Vineyard humiliation, I stopped trying to win Patricia's approval. Instead, I poured everything into launching my own label. I took a loan against our apartment, without telling James how much, worked nights and weekends, and slowly built Elysian from nothing. The name was my private joke. In Greek mythology, the Elysian fields were paradise, accessible only to the worthy, a place Patricia would never reach. For 2 years, I kept my growing success quiet, not just from Patricia, but from most of the family. James knew, of course. He'd been my rock, my legal advisor, my midnight coffee maker. But we agreed that my success should be mine first, earned without the Walsh name or connections. That decision paid off beyond my wildest dreams. 3 weeks before that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, Vogue had featured my collection. A week later, Elysian secured the Neiman Marcus deal. The morning of Thanksgiving, my team confirmed we'd be dressing Zendaya for her next premiere. As my secret success grew, so did Patricia's disdain. She'd begun dropping hints to James about more suitable career paths for me, even emailing him job listings at her friends' charitable foundations. "Just until you start a family," she'd say, as if my ambitions were a temporary inconvenience. For our third Thanksgiving as a married couple, Patricia had planned an elaborate dinner at their Boston home. 5 courses, family from across the country, and several distinguished guests she was eager for James to impress. I knew what that meant. Another opportunity to remind everyone that her son had married beneath him. What I didn't know was that this dinner would become the setting for a confrontation 2 years in the making. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned with a series of texts from Patricia, reminders about arrival time, wine preferences, and a final message that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. "Wear something appropriate, dear. The Cabots will be there. They're practically American fashion royalty." The Cabots, of course. Rebecca Cabot ran a luxury department store chain that had rejected my early collection without even looking at it. Her husband, Timothy, sat on the board of the Council of Fashion Designers of America. They were exactly the kind of people Patricia worshipped. Old money with the power to open or close doors in my industry. "She's trying to intimidate you," James said as I stared at my closet. "Wear whatever makes you feel powerful." That's when I decided to wear the prototype, a seemingly simple black dress with architectural seaming that had taken me months to perfect. No flashy logos, no obvious branding, just impeccable craftsmanship that only those with a trained eye would recognize. I paired it with the jade pendant my grandmother had smuggled out of China, my talisman of resilience. As we pulled up to the Walsh family brownstone on Beacon Hill, I felt my phone buzz. It was my production manager. "Neiman Marcus just doubled their order. They want exclusivity. Call me ASA." I showed James the text, and he squeezed my hand. "That's incredible, Liz. Should we tell them tonight?" "Let's see how it goes," I said, already knowing Patricia would find some way to diminish this achievement. The house was a showcase of old Boston wealth, oriental rugs over hardwood floors, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, silver that had to be at least 200 years old. Patricia greeted us in the foyer, air-kissing James and giving me a quick once-over before frowning slightly. "Eliza, dear, how understated you look tonight," she said, making it sound like a character flaw. The house was already full of Walsh relatives and Patricia's carefully curated guests. James's cousin Abigail, the only family member I genuinely liked, winked at me from across the room. She knew about Elysian and had actually ordered one of my jackets, though Patricia remained oblivious to this fact. I made small talk with James's aunts and uncles. all while feeling Patricia's eyes following me around the room. When the Cabots arrived, she practically shoved other guests aside to introduce them to James. "And this is his wife, Eliza," she added as an afterthought. "She has a little clothing project she works on." Rebecca Cabot extended her hand. "How interesting! What sort of clothing?" Before I could answer, Patricia laughed. "Oh, nothing you would carry in your stores, Rebecca. Very niche." She emphasized the word like it was synonymous with worthless. I smiled tightly. "Contemporary women's wear, actually." "Eliza studied at Parsons," James added, his hand protectively at my back. Timothy Cabot raised an eyebrow. "Parsons produces some excellent designers. What's your label called?" Again, Patricia interrupted. "Shall we move to the dining room? The chef is timing everything precisely." Throughout the first course, a butternut squash soup that Patricia reminded everyone had been featured in Bon Appetit, the conversation revolved around the Walshes' recent achievements. James's father boasted about his latest corporate merger. His brother detailed his new sailing yacht. His 16-year-old niece was apparently a violin prodigy headed for Juilliard. When James mentioned winning an important case for his pro bono client, a victory I knew he was genuinely proud of, Patricia quickly steered the conversation back to his brother's more lucrative corporate law practice. By the time the turkey arrived, I was on my third glass of wine and feeling the familiar tension headache that accompanied Walsh family gatherings. Across the table, Rebecca Cabot was discussing fashion trends with Patricia, who nodded as if she were Anna Wintour herself. "The problem with fashion today," Patricia proclaimed, "is that true quality has become so rare. So many cheap knockoffs flooding the market." Rebecca nodded sagely. "Absolutely. Though there are a few exciting new American designers emerging. There's one label that's creating quite a buzz. We just placed a significant order with them." My heart skipped. She had to be talking about Elysian. "I can't recall the name," Rebecca continued, "but their construction is impeccable. Very architectural, clean lines. The designer apparently has some Asian heritage that influences the precision of the work." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Probably one of those mass market brands with a good marketing team. You know how they are, style over substance." The table grew uncomfortably quiet. Even those who didn't know about my career could sense the undercurrent of condescension. James cleared his throat, about to defend me, when his father quickly changed the subject to politics. As dessert was being served, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from Women's Wear Daily. "Breakout label Elysian signs landmark deal with Neiman Marcus." The article was already published. Soon everyone in the industry would know. I showed James under the table, and he squeezed my knee in support. That's when Patricia, perhaps sensing she was losing control of her carefully orchestrated evening, decided to focus her attention directly on me. "Eliza, dear," she called from the head of the table, her voice carrying over the side conversations. "I've been meaning to ask, how is your little clothing hobby going? Still making those, what were they, casual pieces?" The table quieted again. 20 pairs of eyes turned to me. "Actually, it's going quite well," I said carefully. "How lovely," Patricia smiled thinly. "You know, Rebecca's stores have a small section for local designers. Perhaps she could look at your work. Something simple, like," she gestured vaguely at my dress, "that might work for their discount section." And there it was. The moment the tension that had been building for 3 years reached its breaking point. "Oh, darling, that dress looks economical." Patricia's words cut through the ambient dinner conversation. The table fell silent. Even the servers paused, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Though I suppose on your budget, you do what you can. I felt James tense beside me, ready to intervene as he had countless times before. But something inside me had finally snapped, a dam breaking after years of calculated slights. What exactly about this dress looks cheap to you, Patricia? I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Patricia blinked, unused to direct confrontation. She recovered quickly, her society smile firmly in place. I didn't say cheek, dear. Just, well, not everyone can afford designer quality. No shame in that. Interesting perspective. I smoothed my hands over the fabric of my dress. What would you consider designer quality? Sensing an opportunity to display her supposed expertise, Patricia warmed to the topic. Well, it's about the details, isn't it? The precision of the seams, the quality of the fabric, the architectural structure that only comes from proper training and tradition. She glanced at Rebecca Cabot for approval. Mass-market pieces simply can't compare. And this dress? I pressed. What specifically makes it look economical? Patricia laughed lightly, looking around the table for support. Well, the simplicity, for one. And the cut is rather ordinary, isn't it? Nothing like that gorgeous Armani that Rebecca is wearing. Rebecca Cabot shifted uncomfortably. Actually, Patricia, I was just thinking that Eliza's dress has quite remarkable structure. Those seams are extremely precise. Patricia waved this away. You're too kind, Rebecca. Always trying to encourage the young ones. I took a deep breath. 3 years of diminishment, of being treated like an accessory to James rather than a person with my own accomplishments and worth. 3 years of swallowing my responses to preserve family peace. No more. Patricia, I said calmly, reaching for my phone, have you heard of a label called Elysian? She frowned, caught off guard by the change in subject. I don't believe so. Is it one of those Instagram brands the young people are wearing? Rebecca Cabot sat up straighter. Elysian is the label I was telling you about earlier, Patricia, the one we just placed that significant order with. She turned to me with dawning realization. Wait, are you... I founded Elysian 2 years ago, I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the dining room. This economical dress is from our spring collection. I turned my phone toward Patricia, showing her the Women's Wear Daily article. The collection that Neiman Marcus just signed an exclusive 7-figure deal for this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally a desperate attempt to save face. Well, she stammered, how wonderful that you kept it a secret, though I'm sure the Walsh name opened some doors for you. I never used the Walsh name, I cut in, not once. I built this company on my own merit, my own talent, and my own heritage. I touched my grandmother's jade pendant. The precision you mocked comes from techniques my grandmother brought from Shanghai. The simplicity you dismissed took 3 months to perfect. Timothy Cabot leaned forward. You're the designer behind Elysian, the architectural minimalism collection that's been selling out in pre-orders? I nodded. Fascinating, he said. We've been trying to secure an appointment with your team for weeks, Rebecca added. Your pieces were the highlight of our buyers' meeting last month. Patricia's face had gone from pink to white. James's father was looking between us with newfound respect. Abigail, James's cousin, was grinning broadly. I stood up, suddenly needing air. This economical dress will retail for $2,800 when it hits stores in spring. The Vogue spread featuring this design comes out next week." I looked directly at Patricia. "I've never needed your approval or your connections. I've succeeded despite your constant attempts to belittle me." James stood beside me, his hand at the small of my back. "My wife is being modest," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Elysian is projected to hit 8 figures in revenue next year. The little clothing project you've been mocking is now dressing A-list celebrities and being fought over by luxury retailers." Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. For the first time in our relationship, she had nothing to say. "If you'll excuse us," I said, gathering my purse, "we should go. I have an early call with our Milan office tomorrow." As we turned to leave, Rebecca Cabot stood as well. "Eliza, I'd love to continue our conversation about potential collaboration. Your work is exceptional." "Thank you," I replied. "My team will be in touch." We walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and into the crisp Boston night. Behind us, through the still open door, I could hear the explosion of conversation, Patricia's shrill voice rising above the others. I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell me? And then James closed the door, and we were alone on the sidewalk, both of us shaking with adrenaline and something that felt remarkably like freedom. In the Uber ride back to our hotel, James and I sat in stunned silence. 3 years of careful restraint, of swallowing my responses to Patricia's barbs, gone in 5 minutes of glorious, terrifying honesty. "Are you okay?" James finally asked as we pulled up to the Four Seasons. "I think so," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you." He laughed, a genuine, relieved sound. "Embarrassed me? Liz, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You should have done it years ago." In our suite, my phone exploded with notifications. Abigail had texted, "Holy shit, you legend! Dad just called Patricia delusional to her face." James's brother sent a surprisingly supportive message. "Mom's been awful to you. Sorry I never said anything before." Even James's father had emailed, a formal note requesting a proper discussion of your business achievements at your convenience. The fashion world was reacting too. The WWD article was being shared widely. 3 more celebrity stylists had reached out about red carpet placements. Our website traffic had crashed from sudden volume. But it was the message from Rebecca Cabot that truly stunned me. Brilliant work tonight, both the dress and the revelation. I've been trying to get Patricia to see beyond her narrow worldview for decades. Let's talk next week about featuring Elysian in all our flagship stores. P.S. Timothy is still laughing about the look on Patricia's face. Around midnight, the texts from Patricia started. First, defensive. "I was only trying to help you fit in." Then, accusatory. "You deliberately humiliated me in front of my friends." Finally, at 3 a.m., something approaching contrition. "Perhaps we should discuss this misunderstanding when emotions aren't so high." "Are you going to respond?" James asked, reading over my shoulder. "Not tonight," I said. "Maybe not for a while." The next morning, over room service breakfast, we debated our next steps. James had already decided to skip the remaining family weekend events. "I'm not subjecting you to more of her backhanded apologies," he said firmly. Around noon, an unexpected visitor knocked on our hotel room door. It was James's grandmother, Eleanor Walsh, the 87-year-old matriarch who rarely left her Cambridge home these days. "Grandma?" James said, clearly shocked. "How did you get here?" "Uber," she replied briskly, walking past him into our suite. "Marvelous invention. Now, Eliza, I understand you put Patricia in her place last night." I glanced at James, who looked equally confused. We had a disagreement." Eleanor sat down, arranging herself regally on the sofa. According to Timothy Cabot, you revealed yourself as a fashion powerhouse and left my daughter-in-law speechless. First time for everything, I suppose. To my surprise, Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a copy of Women's Wear Daily. I had my assistant pick this up this morning. Is this your work? She pointed to the Elysian feature. I nodded. Extraordinary, she said, examining the photos closely. Reminds me of early Balenciaga. Clean lines, architectural, but still feminine. She looked up. I studied fashion design before I married into this insufferable family, you know. I didn't know, I said, genuinely surprised. Not something the Walshes advertise, Eleanor said dryly. A Walsh woman with creative ambitions. Scandalous. She closed the magazine. Patricia called me at 6 this morning, beside herself. Seems to think you orchestrated some grand humiliation. I started to defend myself, but Eleanor held up a hand. Nonsense, of course. From what I gather, you simply stated facts that Patricia should have known had she bothered to take any interest in your career. She fixed me with a penetrating stare. Why didn't you tell the family about your success? The question caught me off guard. I wanted to succeed on my own terms, without using the Walsh name or connections. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Smart girl. The Walsh name opens doors, but not always the right ones. She turned to James. Your mother is hosting lunch at the club. She's expecting both of you to apologize. James stiffened. That's not happening. Good, Eleanor said, surprising us both. About time someone stood up to her. She turned back to me. But I do think you should come to my house for tea this afternoon. There's something I'd like to show you. That afternoon, Eleanor's driver took us to her Cambridge home, a historic mansion filled with museum-quality antiques, and, surprisingly, an entire room dedicated to fashion design. Sketches covered the walls, and a vintage dress form stood in the corner. My sanctuary, Eleanor explained, watching my face. Started designing again after George died. Have to do something to stay sharp. She led us to a closet, from which she pulled a garment bag. Before you disappear from family events forever, which would be entirely understandable, I wanted you to see this. Inside the bag was a black evening gown with a structural elegance that took my breath away. The tag inside read, Eleanor Walsh Designs, 1956. You had your own label? I asked, examining the impeccable construction. For 3 years, she said, until my father-in-law threatened to disinherit George if I continued with such unseemly commercial ventures. She touched the fabric gently. Different times. I chose family peace. She looked up at me sharply. You won't have to make that choice. The world has changed, and you have something I didn't. A husband who supports your ambitions rather than tolerating them. James put his arm around me, and Eleanor nodded approvingly. Now, she said, about Patricia. She's been insufferable since George put her in charge of the family's social obligations. Thinks it makes her the Queen of Boston. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. She's planning the annual Walsh Foundation Gala next month, her crowning event of the year. We usually skip it, James said. This year, you'll attend, Eleanor stated firmly, as my special guests, and Eliza will dress me. Over the next month, several things happened. Elysian's deal with Neiman Marcus expanded to international markets. We secured a feature in Vogue that specifically highlighted the Asian influences in my designs. And most surprisingly, various Walshes began reaching out, some with genuine interest in my work, others clearly hoping to capitalize on my sudden success. Patricia remained the notable exception. Her texts stopped after that night. James's father reported that she refused to discuss me at all. Then, a week before the Walsh Foundation Gala, Eleanor called. "Patricia's in a state," she reported gleefully. Her original designer pulled out, and now she has nothing to wear to her precious gala. The irony is delicious. I knew what Eleanor was suggesting before she said it. "You want me to offer to dress her?" "I want you to consider it," Eleanor corrected. "It would be a remarkable gesture of grace, but only if you can do it without compromising your integrity." That evening, I discussed it with James. "It feels like letting her off the hook," I admitted. "Then don't do it," he said simply. "You don't owe her anything." But I kept thinking about Eleanor, who had sublimated her talent to keep family peace, about my grandmother, who rebuilt her career from nothing in a strange country, about all the women who compromise and the ones who don't. The next morning, I called Patricia directly. "Eliza," she answered, her voice cool, "this is unexpected." "I understand you need a dress for the gala," I said, skipping the pleasantries. A pause. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter? I'd like to offer you an Elysian original. I'll design it specifically for you." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked, suspicion evident. "Because I'm not interested in prolonging this war," I said honestly, "and because I'm proud of my work and believe you'd look beautiful in one of my designs." Another long pause. "I suppose I could consider it." The fitting sessions over the next week were tense but professional. Patricia made no reference to Thanksgiving dinner, and neither did I. She was a difficult client, opinionated, demanding perfection, but I found myself respecting her eye for detail. On the night of the gala, when she emerged in the midnight blue column dress I'd created for her, even Patricia couldn't hide her pleasure at her reflection. "It's quite extraordinary," she admitted. "Thank you," I said. "It suits you." She met my eyes in the mirror. "I've been unfair to you, Eliza." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Patricia, it was seismic. At the gala, when people complimented her dress, Patricia did something I never expected. "It's Elysian," she said, "my daughter-in-law's design. Not James's wife, not the girl who makes clothes. My professional identity, acknowledged at last." Later that evening, Eleanor found me at the bar. "Well played," she said, raising her champagne glass. "Kill them with kindness and exceptional talent." "I didn't do it to win," I told her. "That's why it worked," she replied with a wink. "Now, about that atelier space I own on Newberry Street, I think it's time Elysian had a proper Boston flagship, don't you?" That was 3 years ago. Today, Elysian has flagship stores in New York, Boston, and Shanghai, the last one a tribute to my grandmother, whose techniques and resilience flow through every piece I design. Patricia and I will never be best friends, but we found a respectful equilibrium. She consults on the more conservative pieces in my collections, lending her eye for Boston society preferences. Eleanor, at 90, still comes to every runway show, sitting front row with her sharp critiques and sharper wit. The dress that started it all, my economical black sheath, is now part of our permanent collection. We call it the Patricia. She pretends to be annoyed, but I've caught her smiling when customers ask for it by name. What I learned from that Thanksgiving night wasn't about revenge or even vindication. It was about claiming my space unapologetically in my career, in my relationships, and in the narrative of my own life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't exposing someone else's flaws, but revealing your own strength. If you're holding back your light to keep the peace or make yourself smaller for someone else's comfort, stop. The right people will celebrate your brilliance, not dim it. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs permission to shine. Sometimes the family we create through friendship and shared values gives us the courage our blood relations couldn't. And sometimes the person who once tried to diminish you becomes the unlikely champion of your success, but only after you've become your own.